Thank you very much. Salam alaikum. Good afternoon to everybody. Since we are talking about democracy, and we are already late by one session, I don't want to make that decision to be between you and your lunch, because protecting democracy and peace would be slightly challenging in that case. But if you're okay, I'm fine to continue with this. Is everybody okay with this? Yes. Oh, good. Then we are okay to talk about peace and democracy. Your Excellencies, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's such a pleasure to see you all, old friends, and then meet new friends. Let me thank ICD for hosting us so generously and bringing us together to talk about consequential issues of our lifetime, peace and democracy. After such eloquent speakers as the former chairman of the B&H presidency and Her Excellency Deputy Minister, I find it a bit challenging to keep the interest and attention of this magnificent audience. I'll do my best. I talked about what happened to democracy in Afghanistan last time. I believe it's time to talk about what we can do together for its future. A future that is not only important for Afghans alone, but also for the region and the rest of the international community. About the past, simply put, His Excellency the Chairman made some very good points. The Afghan leaders, the Taliban leaders, the unilateral decision by the US administration, and the reckless pursuit of self-interested security policy of the Pakistani army led to the collapse of the Afghan democracy. They couldn't work together. They could not agree on their common interest. Every one of them should have known better that protecting the Afghan democracy and stability was in their interest. First, they failed to understand that, and second, they failed to cooperate with each other. Perhaps the interesting news is that all four of them have lost. And it's a threat to all four categories of the actors who were responsible for the failure in Afghanistan. I will not dwell upon that now, but the question that is posed to us is, what about the future? Is there any hope? Is there anything we can do together? We strongly believe that yes, there is hope, and there are good ideas and dedicated partners and actors that can work together to realize that vision. This brings me to my first issue. Why is Afghanistan so important? What are the stakes for the Afghans, for the region, and for the international community? Dear colleagues, it's a conflict without exaggeration that is influenced and fed by other conflicts in the world. And in return, it influences and feeds into other conflicts, whether by state actors or non-state actors, by Afghans or regional or international actors. So it's important for everyone. The first stake is security. The UN is publishing regularly alarming reports about terrorism and its growth in Afghanistan, in the region actually, between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And there is no effective policy to fight terrorism. In fact, if anything that is happening, it's selectivity. They distinguish between good and bad terrorists. So they fight some, but they don't fight others. And that selectivity kills any kind of unity of purpose and action to defeat terrorism. That selectivity was also demonstrated at international level of conflicts. One invasion is acceptable, another invasion is not. Selectivity without rules, complying with the rules that we have agreed, is the key enemy of peace and democracy. Because you cannot sustain democracy without the rule of law. That's what we heard. And the rule of law means you have to apply laws on everybody in any case. Second big interest for both Afghans and the international community is the continued deprivation of Afghan women and Afghan people, which results in a massive level of impoverishment and population movement. We heard about how involuntary movement of people from their homes. Her Excellency spoke about it. It is not a choice that people have. It is imposition of authoritarian and draconian policies that lead to people making decisions to leave their homes. And now that becomes a threat to stability, not only in the region, but also beyond the region. So with these two significant threats in mind, there's a third issue that we need to be aware of, that neither the Afghans nor our international partners have any significant level of policy coherence, consensus, or level of cooperation to address these two threats. They've left it to themselves to solve themselves, and it's a very bad policy. These threats will not solve themselves by themselves. These threats will have far-reaching consequences, not just affecting the Afghan people, but affecting the region, Europe, and unfortunately, the global community, including North America. Because we are talking about terrorism, we are talking about drugs, we are talking about organized crimes, and we are talking about forced population displacement. The second topic I wanted to address is there any hope to address this deteriorating situation? Dear colleagues, yes. It first starts with understanding and consensus. Luckily, I'm glad we have a future member of the UN Security Council, Greece, here today. Luckily, in December last year, the UN Security Council agreed on something. They agreed that unless the Taliban administration respects fully Afghanistan's international obligations, including women's rights and human rights, they will not be ready to recognize them as a legitimate government. That's a very good point. Second, they strongly recommended to the member nations to support an intra-Afghan political settlement, which is key to this crisis. Again, if you look at these two critical decisions, they represent consensus not only among the international partners, but also the Afghan people. The Afghan people are quite fine with these 2 points. But now the question is that the international community has made a good decision, but is it willing to implement that decision, to throw its political, diplomatic, and economic resources, which is my third issue. Again, the good news is that they've taken the right step in the right direction to create the Doha political process. Dear colleagues, there are at least 25 countries from the region, Europe and North America, that are participating in that Doha political process. You can imagine how high the stakes are for them. But we are hoping that they will do a good job, that it is not just a fig leaf to dodge their responsibility, that we are hoping that the political process of Doha will lead to a full realization of the vision laid out by the UN Security Council in its resolution 2721. Recently they had their third meeting, beginning of June, the Doha process, and in that meeting they made some progress. But in a way, they took 2 steps forward and 2 steps backward. It was good that all of these countries came together, from US and Canada to all of major European nations to all of the influential nations of the region, from India to Pakistan, Iran to Saudi Arabia, Qatar to UAE, and all of the 6 Afghan neighbors, including China and Russia. It was good they came together. Our concern was that their conflicts and rivalries elsewhere might affect Afghanistan badly. And unfortunately, that is happening. The good news, however, was that they showed some leadership and wisdom, that perhaps this time cooperation in Afghanistan is better than lack thereof, that it might serve their interest more than lack of cooperation. So that was a good step forward. Second, they managed to finally bring the Taliban to that meeting and expose them to a common position of the international community, that their policies on women are neither representing the Afghan cultural norms nor true Islamic tenets. That these were Taliban policies, neither Islamic nor Afghan. So that was good. They made that point. Second point they made was that they would not recognize such a government without first meeting of the Afghanistan's international obligations. These points were fine, but the steps backwards were that they did not invite any other Afghan but the Taliban to that meeting. And yet, essential to the resolution of this conflict is intra-Afghan negotiations. Who are the other Afghans that they would negotiate with? Is it between Taliban or the international community, or is it between Taliban and the non-Taliban Afghans, and especially the absence of Afghan women? So that was quite a serious failure. Of course, the UN, with support from some influential countries, said, well, we wanted to invite Afghan women and Afghan men, politicians and civil society, but the Taliban disagreed. And therefore, we succumbed to the Taliban's pressure. Well, that's not the point. The point is to build a unified position so that the Taliban listen. A second step backwards was their failure to discuss the agenda that was mandated by the UN Security Council. So they brought some sweets to the table for the Taliban and said, if you come to this meeting, we will not talk about women's rights. We will not talk about human rights. We will talk about counter-narcotics and alternative livelihood. Taliban have implemented a ruthless counter-narcotics policy. I mean, yes, it's good news that they have banned cultivation of poppy, but it's bad news that they did it without any consideration of over 1 million families in Afghanistan who have been living on cultivation of poppy, not out of their own choice, but out of necessity to survive. So a more humane policy would have been ban it, but provide alternative livelihoods to people. And the second agenda point for them was, we will talk to you about lifting sanctions on Afghan banks and support private sector development. With all due respect to my colleagues and with full understanding of their constraints, this was disingenuous. Nobody believed that the 25 countries were serious. Well, first of all, for alternative livelihood, you would need between $3 to $4 billion annually. And that will have to go through a state budget. If the international community does not recognize Taliban as a legitimate government, that money would never come for any reason. So that was a lie. Second, that they would lift the sanctions on Afghan banks. Well, we all know what rules are being imposed on the International Financial Action Task Force. Unless the Afghan banks meet those rules, I mean, countries in the neighborhood have failed to meet those rules. There will be no way for them to remove those sanctions. So, to be frank with you, it was good that they started a discussion with the Taliban, but it was a failure to focus that discussion on the right issues and to invite the non-Taliban Afghans to that meeting. My last point, we therefore have a couple of well-informed recommendations, especially as His Excellency, former President of Romania, said. The people who have lived through these crises and the people who have devoted their life to the service of their nation, they will have to participate in that discussion. So, recommendation 1 will be for our international partners. Focus on the real agenda. The real agenda is women's rights, human rights, and legitimate governance in Afghanistan, without which there will never be any peace in Afghanistan. Because simply, no Afghan would be ready to reconcile with the Taliban without these three things to be first put in place. And no country in the world would be ready to take the risk of recognizing the Taliban without these three things to be first observed by that government. Second recommendation, that the process must be inclusive. It cannot succeed to achieve what the UN Security Council decided without an intra-Afghan negotiation. An intra-Afghan negotiation and political settlement cannot happen without Afghan women and Afghan credible political and civil society actors. Third recommendation, if there's one way to influence the Taliban's calculation and policies, that is through unity. There must be unity on the part of the regional and international actors, and there must be unity on the part of the Afghan women and men to challenge the Taliban. Unity at two levels will carry the only chance and likelihood of influencing the Taliban. Finally, just to echo the words of His Excellency the Chairman, it's a responsibility of the US and EU to honestly and transparently take action for the protection of their own interest and the interest of the Afghan people. Terrorism, counter-narcotics, prevention of mass refugee movements, and prevention of organized crimes are in the interest of everybody. These interests cannot be served but democracy, good governance, and the rule of law in Afghanistan. And they will have to honestly admit that fact and deliver on it. I know the situation at the moment is a bit difficult to expect a positive response from policymakers at the international level. But I strongly believe in the wisdom and good heart of European people and our North American partners, that they can make the right decision. They can influence their policymakers that peace in Europe, stability in Europe cannot happen without peace, stability, and women's rights in Afghanistan. As long as those threats are there, there will never be any stability anywhere, given our global connectivity. With this, Mr. Moderator, I should stop here and do not want to make myself even more unpopular and keep them away from their lunch.
Sharing with us your thoughts and insights. So I think we have time for 2 questions at least. So we have one here and one here, yes. So can you please pass the microphone? Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Hayat Mohammed. I'm originally Sudanese, but now in the UK.
Your mic, I think, is turned off.
Yeah.
It's on.
Okay. Thank you again, and thank you for ICD. I'm Hayat Mohammed. I'm from Sudan originally, but now I'm in UK, refugee. I think you are part of who were doing democracy in Afghanistan before the Taliban government now. And again, you are speaking about the same topics, human rights, women's rights, and not about the Afghani internal affairs, how you work with people to make stability, to make them stay at home. And that is, I think, the same problem of all oppositions who have like a Western background, educated there. I think they consider me one of who cannot be loyal to West, and they didn't give me my PhD after I passed. And I went back without PhD, and I stayed at home, but now after everything went worse, I fled and came back and became refugees. But why you, as a politician, don't think about your people? You had governed Afghanistan for 20 years, I think, and you were backed by the international community, and they paid a lot for you, and then you failed, and then Taliban came back. Why? And again, now you are speaking about the same issue. You want the European Union and your United States again to make solution for you by sanction, by imposing human rights, by punishment for Taliban. And this is the main problem of our countries, our politician. It is not democracy. It is neoliberalism. It is forcing the people to do what the Western people want, regardless of what they want to be in their countries. And that will not make stability and peace in Afghanistan or in everywhere else. Yeah. So let us ruled by our people, and let the people there reject or accept the rulers without any intervention from international community. And we now, we know how we backed the Libyan people, because Gaddafi was dictatorship, and now no peace there. People are, even they lost the country. We backed people in Yemen. They lost the country. All of them are here and there in Europe. We backed in Iraq the opposition against Saddam Hussein. They lost their country. And in Syria and in Sudan, we now lost our country. We have no home. And the strange thing, the Western now as backing Janjaweed now, which is killing us, looting us, raping our women. And before, they fought the former government because they were backing Janjaweed. It's no standard in Western policy towards us. Leave us alone. Leave us alone. Let us fire who is not working for our benefits, and accept who can make stability, peace, and let us stay at home. Thank you very much.
You want me to take? Oh, okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much, my sister Hayat. I couldn't agree with you more. Everything you said, I agree with you. But let me explain how we look at it. First of all, I belong to a group of Afghan politicians who have asked for national and international action for accountability. And we said that we will be the first to participate in that accountability process, so that we explain and have ourselves held accountable for what we did or what we did not do in terms of protecting the Afghan democracy and the Afghan republic. So without accountability, I don't believe that politicians will be encouraged enough to do the right thing for their people. So for your information, that issue is on the record, and I have said that I will be the first to participate in that accountability process. Second, my sister, we are not copying European or other values and bring them to Afghanistan and then talk to Taliban to accept them. Our message to the Taliban is very simple. We say, let's put the issue of rights of the Afghan people, men and women, and the issue of governance in Afghanistan to our people. Whatever our people decided, we are okay with that. That's number one. Number two, we said to them that your interpretation of Sharia differs from our interpretation of Sharia. We said, let's go to the 57 plus members of the OIC, members of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, and put it to them, because we are not the only Muslims in the world, and put it to them and say, is this acceptable to deprive an Afghan woman of the right to education, the right to work, the right to movement, free movement? Is that acceptable to them? So we basically said that the Taliban should not create a new reality for our people. They should allow the process to be determined by the Afghan people, and if we have disagreement on Sharia, then we go to the rest of the Muslim world. So on these issues, we are clear that we are not asking for anything foreign. We are asking for our national values, interests, and shared future. Third issue, we are still, you're absolutely right, if we have an expectation from Europe and North America to come and help. We're not asking them to come and help. We're asking them not to harm that process. Support that process so that it can lead to the empowerment of the Afghan people to make their decisions. We are not asking for another intervention from Europe or North America. We are asking them for support for the Afghan people to make those decisions themselves. So again, to be clear, I said that the two things that the UN Security Council decided upon in December last year, one, that Afghanistan should be at peace with itself and with its neighborhood. Basically, they said counterterrorism. And second, that Afghanistan should honor the international obligations of the Afghan state. We have Afghan, Muslim, and international obligations. And our state must be respectful of those obligations. So what we are expecting the international community to do is to create an enabling environment for the Afghan people to determine their own future, not to determine their future for them. Thank you, ma'am.
And I believe we have time for one more question. It's a quick question, also a quick answer. We'll appreciate.
Thank you so much, Excellency. My name is Jean-Marie Kouassi, from the US, but originally from the Ivory Coast. I would like, first of all, to say that I was completely really impressed with what you said, because one thing that we don't hear a lot is for people to recognize when they have their shortcomings, and that you did. The second thing that I thought was very important is the fact that we are in the global world, and we cannot live separately. And therefore, if there is a problem, there's a need for interconnectedness, and helping each other will make this world a better world. Now, getting to my question, you did mention that within the Afghan community, you have the Afghan Taliban and non-Taliban. So from that perspective, do you think that using cultural diplomacy as a tool for the internal conflict could be of great success, looking at what you're trying to accomplish in terms of the peace within Afghanistan? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yes, not to elaborate too much on that issue, but we said there are two critical instruments whereby Afghan politicians and the Taliban leaders can be held responsible. Number one is Afghanistan is part of the ICC, the International Criminal Court. We are a signatory to all human rights instruments. Any violation of those must either be prosecuted at national level, and if the nation state is unwilling or incapable to do it, then it must be prosecuted by the International Court. This is a serious issue, not only for the past crimes, but also the crimes that are happening now, including the gender apartheid. So that's number one. We are not, again, asking for anything new. We are asking for something that we have agreed on. Second instrument is the UN Convention against corruption, that all Afghan leaders must be held accountable. And that convention creates responsibilities for a variety of nations, Europe and North America and Middle East, anywhere. They must cooperate. They must investigate and cooperate so that the right message is sent that if any leader is failing their people, stealing from their people, violating their rights, that they will not have immunity, that they cannot tomorrow hide either in Middle East or Europe or North America. That's when we can put an end to impunity. And that needs to happen now. Second point, on cultural diplomacy, again, you're absolutely right. At the heart of cultural diplomacy is engagement, talking to people. Because if there's one thing that humanity has learned as part of its moral obligations, that before you do anything, you talk, you explore ways in which you can resolve your disagreements peacefully and do not resort to violence. So that is a norm which is common to any civilization anywhere in the world. And Afghanistan is part of that civilization. So we say to the Taliban, come and talk. That's why we are placing emphasis on intra-Afghan negotiation. And we also said to them, if the Taliban, of course, the Taliban may be a few thousand people, but the rest of Afghans are over 40 million people. So these Afghans need to have a say in the application of Islamic rules and the values that belong to the Afghan society and the international values that Afghans have embraced. I mean, these international values have not been thrown at us by Europe or North America. These were our values. These were our values, and what happened that after the Second World War, these values were compiled and agreed upon and made. I mean, the development of these values, every civilization had a role in it. Every faith had a role in it, including our civilization and Islam. So now these values will have to be respected by the Taliban. And they should be part of that discussion so that we reach a settlement. That settlement is key, because a settlement would allow the Taliban and non-Taliban Afghans to live in one country and in one system. And then part of that settlement is that we have not only an obligation towards our people, but towards the rest of the world. There shouldn't be any terrorist in Afghanistan to threaten either our people or other people. So that's the kind of discussion we need to have with them. So cultural diplomacy is one of those moral instruments that humanity has created to resolve conflicts and reach an acceptable end state and settlement. I hope I have not defined it in any other way than the ICD is defining it. Thank you.